When the air changed in the studio, the cameras rolled, and the bright studio lights lit up every corner of the stage, the audience clapped, their energy high, as the host introduced the day's special segment. On one side of the couch sat Mark Wahlberg, leaning back with the easy confidence of a seasoned Hollywood star. On the other side sat KeanuReeves.com and collected, his hands folded loosely on his lap, wearing a simple black blazer over a plain gray shirt. It was supposed to be a friendly interview, promotional stop for a new film they had both worked on. But from the moment they greeted each other, something in the air felt off. Mark was smiling, but there was an edge in his tone. The audience didn't notice it right away, but Keanu did. The conversation started light, with jokes about long shooting days and stunts gone wrong. The host laughed along, but then turned the topic to personal values and work ethics in Hollywood. That's when the tension began to rise. Mark leaned forward, a grin on his face, and said, "You know, Keanu's one of those guys who spends more time doing charity work than actually working in Hollywood. I don't know how you afford it." Man, a few audience members chuckled. The comment was framed like a joke, but it carried an undertone that wasn't entirely playful. Keanu smiled faintly, but his voice was steady when he answered, "Helping people is still work, Mark. Just doesn't show up on a paycheck." The audience gave a light applause. Mark shrugged. "Yeah, but you can't save the world by planting trees and fixing bikes for kids. I mean, let's be real." The room shifted. The host gave an awkward laugh, trying to move things along, but Keanu's expression had changed, subtle but unmistakable. His eyes locked on Mark's, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller. "It's not about saving the whole world," Keanu said softly. "It's about saving someone's world. You'll never know when one act of kindness might be the reason a person gets through another day." The audience grew still. Mark leaned back, clearly not expecting that kind of answer. "Yeah, but you're Keanu Reeves. You could be running big foundations, making headlines, doing something massive. Why waste time with small stuff?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Small stuff is what most people need. You think it's small, but to them, everything." The host sensed the tension and tried to break it with a question about the film again, but it was too late. The dynamic had shifted. People in the audience were leaning forward now, sensing that something important was unfolding. Mark smirked. "Right, but don't you ever feel like you're, I don't know, doing it to feel good about yourself?" Keanu didn't flinch. His voice stayed calm. "If helping someone makes you feel good, that's not a bad thing. But that's not why I do it. I do it because I remember being the person who needed help and didn't get it." The crowd reacted with a low murmur. A few heads turned toward each other, whispering, and then, from the third row, a young man raised his hand. "Aye!" His voice trembled as he called out, "Can I say something about that?" The host looked startled, but motioned for a microphone. Crew scrambled to hand it to him. Mark crossed his arms, curious. Keanu's eyes softened. The young man took a breath, his voice unsteady but clear. "I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for what you call small stuff, Mark. And I think everyone here needs to know what Keanu really did for me." The entire room went silent. Every camera tilted toward him, and in that moment the interview wasn't just an interview anymore. It was about to become something unforgettable. Asterisk, the voice from the third row. The young man in the third row stood slowly, clutching the microphone with both hands. His knees seemed to shake, but his eyes stayed locked on Keanu. The camera zoomed in, the audience leaning forward, sensing this wasn't planned. "My name is Daniel," he began, his voice low, but clear enough to carry through the studio. 3 years ago, I was living in my car. I'd lost my job, my apartment, and honestly, my hope. I was one bad day away from ending everything. A hush fell over the crowd. Even Mark's confident grin faded into something closer to discomfort. Daniel swallowed hard. "One night, I went to a gas station just to get warm coffee. There was this guy there, dressed in a hoodie, buying instant noodles and some bread. When I walked past him, I guess he saw something in my face, because he stopped me and asked if I was okay." He paused, his breath shaking. It was Keanu, but I didn't know it at the time. He didn't say his name. He just said, "You look like you could use a meal." and then he bought me food and sat with me for almost 2 hours. The audience murmured softly, and the cameras cut briefly to Keanu, who was sitting quietly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes gentle. A week later, Daniel continued, he found me again. I don't know how, but he did. He brought me a sleeping bag, a winter coat, and a list of job openings. And when I said I had no way to get there, he gave me a bus pass. I thought that was it, but then he kept checking in on me. Voice cracked now, Keanu. You didn't just help me survive. You helped me remember I was a person worth saving. I have a job now, an apartment. I'm here today because you believed in me when I didn't. The audience broke into applause, long, sustained, emotional. Some stood to clap, others wiped tears from their eyes. Keanu looked down briefly, as if absorbing the weight of Daniel's words. Then he smiled faintly. I'm proud of you, he said softly. Loud enough for the microphones to catch. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier comments now hanging in the air like something sour. The host looked from Daniel to Keanu, realizing the conversation had moved far beyond entertainment, but before anyone could speak, another voice rose from the audience. An older woman this time. I have a story about him too, she said. The crew scrambled to pass her a microphone. The audience turned in her direction. Keanu glanced toward her, already looking like he knew who she was. And in that instant, the tension in the studio deepened again because whatever she was about to say, it was clear this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The woman in the back row of the microphone reached the older woman, her hands trembling as she took it. She looked to be in her late 60s, her hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple floral blouse. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of strength that comes from years of surviving. My name is Evelyn, she said, glancing briefly at the crowd before her gaze settled on Keanu. I wasn't going to speak, but hearing Daniel's story, I can't stay quiet. Keanu leaned forward slightly, listening with the same focus he had given Daniel 6 years ago. Evelyn continued, My husband passed away. It was sudden. I had no savings, no family nearby. I was weeks away from losing my home. One day, I was in line at the grocery store, counting coins to see if I could afford bread and milk. I didn't realize someone was standing behind me watching. Quietly, her voice wavered. That person was Keanu. But I didn't know it then. He waited until I left the store, then followed me outside, not in a threatening way, but careful, respectful. He asked if everything was okay. I told him no. And I don't know why, but I found myself telling him everything. About my husband, my home, the fear that kept me awake every night. The audience was silent now, hanging on every word. A week later, she went on, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a check. Enough to cover my mortgage for an entire year. Was only one sentence written on a small piece of paper. It said, You are not alone. Her voice broke. I recognized the handwriting when I saw it again in a thank you card at the grocery store months later. It was him. He never asked for recognition. He just gave me the chance to breathe again. Some in the crowd were openly crying now. Daniel was wiping his eyes. The host pressed a hand to her chest, clearly moved. Keanu's eyes glistened, but he didn't speak right away. Finally, he said quietly, You kept your home. That's what matters. Mark shifted again, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier words, now echoing back at him in front of a live audience. But before the host could steer the conversation, one of the producers rushed up to the stage, whispering something into her ear. She looked startled, then smiled faintly at Keanu. It seems, the host said, we have someone backstage who's been listening to all of this, and they've asked to come out. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of curiosity. Crossing his face, the host continued, They say you changed their life too, but in a way that's never been told publicly. The audience murmured in anticipation as the backstage curtain began to move. Asterisk, the uninvited Memorith audience shifted in their seats as the curtain at the side of the stage opened. A man in his 40s stepped out, wearing a dark suit with no tie. His walk was steady, but there was something guarded in his expression. Keanu single quotes eyes widened slightly. It wasn't show kit, it was recognition. The host turned toward the cameras. Everyone, please welcome Samuel Hayes. There was light applause, though most of the audience was still trying to place the name. Samuel took a seat on the far end of the couch, closer to Mark than to Keanu. The host smiled. Samuel, I understand you and Keanu have a history. Samuel nodded, his voice low but firm. It goes back almost 15 years, and I never planned to talk about it. But hearing what people have shared today, I realized maybe it's time. Mark leaned back, crossing his arms, clearly interested. Keanu sat quietly, his gaze steady on Samuel. Back then, Samuel continued, I wasn't a good man. I was angry all the time, drinking too much. I burned a lot of bridges, lost a lot of friends. One night I was outside a bar, ready to start a fight with anyone who looked at me wrong. He took a slow breath, and then someone grabbed my arm before I could swing at a guy who didn't even know me. It was Keanu. I knew who he was, but instead of walking away, he stayed. He asked me why I was so angry. I told him it was none of his business. The audience was silent now, leaning in. But he didn't let go, Samuel said. He stood there, calm as anything, while I yelled at him. And when I ran out of words, he just said, You don't have to keep living like this. He gave me his number and told me to call if I ever wanted to talk. Samuel's voice thickened. I didn't call. Not for weeks. But when I finally did, he answered on the first ring. Listened to me for hours that night. And he kept answering over and over until I got sober, till I found steady work, till I learned how to be someone my family could trust again. The audience erupted into applause, some people whistling in support. Samuel glanced at Keanu. You didn't save me with money. You saved me with time. And that's the one thing nobody ever gave me before. Keanu gave a small smile. You did the hard part, Sam. Samuel nodded, looking down, almost shy. Mark, perhaps trying to lighten the mood, said, Well, I guess you've been busy off camera, huh, Keanu? Doc. Keanu turned to him with a faint grin, but his words were serious. We're all busy, Mark. The question is, busy doing what? The crowd reacted instantly, some clapping, others murmuring in agreement. And just when it seemed the energy was at its peak, the host leaned forward with a mischievous smile. Keanu, before this segment ends, we have one last guest. And this one, well, this one goes way back. Keanu's smile faltered just slightly. The first crack in his calm all day, the audience held their breath as the curtain began to move again. The one from the past curtain drew back slowly, and for a moment, the audience couldn't see clearly who was stepping forward, and a woman emerged, slender mid-50s, with warm brown eyes that carried both kindness and a trace of sorrow. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry, her hands clasped in front of her. Keanu's posture changed immediately. He sat up straighter, his eyes locked on her, as if the rest of the room had vanished. The host's tone softened. Keanu, do you know who this is? Keanu's voice was quiet. Yes, this is Claire. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Claire walked slowly toward him, her steps deliberate. When she reached the couch, she didn't sit right away, simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned toward the audience. 35 years ago, I was a struggling single mother, working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. My son was sick and the hospital bills were piling up. I thought I was going to lose everything. And then, a teenage boy who barely knew me showed up at my door with 2 grocery bags and an envelope of cash. Gasps spread across the studio. That boy was Keanu, Claire continued. He was only 19. He didn't have much himself, but he said, I figured you could use this more than I could. I asked him why he was helping me. He just shrugged and said, because someone should. Her voice trembled. What he doesn't know is that money paid for my son's medication. It gave me enough time to keep my job. My son, he grew up healthy because of that act of kindness. He's a father now. And he's here too. The audience collectively gasped again, turning toward the aisle as a tall man stepped forward. Carrying a toddler in his arms, Keanu's size widened. He stood without hesitation, crossing the space between them in 3 quick steps. The man extended a hand, but Keanu bypassed it, pulling him into a hug. The little boy in the man's arms stared at Keanu for a moment, then reached out with tiny hands to touch his face. The audience melted into a wave of applause and soft laughter. Claire wiped her eyes. "You changed 2 generations of my family without ever asking for anything in return." Keanu looked at her, his voice low but steady. "You didn't owe me anything, Claire? I'm just glad you're both here." Mark, who had been unusually quiet through the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this on live TV." The host smiled knowingly. "That's because this isn't about TV. It's about what happens when someone lives their values every single day." But the moment wasn't over yet. Claire looked at Keanu with a faint smile. "There's one more thing you should know, and it might surprise you." Keanu tilted his head slightly, curious, and as she spoke, the words she delivered would leave the entire studio silent, including Keanu himself. The last truth studio was silent as Claire took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving Keanu's. "The money you gave me back then," she began, "wasn't just yours." Keanu's brows furrowed, confused. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries years of a hidden story. "When you handed me that envelope, you told me you had been saving it for something important. What you didn't know was that someone else had slipped extra bills into it without telling you. That someone was your mother." A soft gasp ran through the audience. Keanu's face shifted from confusion to quiet realization. Claire nodded. "She told me later that she wanted you to think it was all you, because she wanted you to feel the full weight of what you'd done. She told me, if he believes in his own ability to give, he'll keep giving." And she was right. He never stopped. Keanu's eyes glistened now, and he lowered his head for a moment. When he looked back up, his voice was quiet but steady. "That sounds like her." The host leaned forward. "So in a way, your kindness has been an echo of hers all these years." Keanu nodded. "She taught me that our value isn't in what we have, it's in what we can share." The audience applauded, slow at first, then building into a standing ovation. Claire reached for his hand, and he took it gently, squeezing it in silent gratitude. Daniel, Evelyn, and Samuel were all watching from their seats, their faces reflecting the same truth everyone in the room now understood. This wasn't just a celebrity being generous. This was a lifetime of choosing to show up for people, over and over, in ways that couldn't be bought or staged. Mark, who had begun the day teasing Keanu's small acts, finally leaned toward his microphone. "I owe you an apology, man," he said, his tone softer than it had been all day. "I get it now. It's not about size, it's about meaning." Keanu gave a small smile. "We all figure it out in our own time." The toddler in the young man's arms let out a giggle, breaking the heaviness in the room. Keanu reached over, brushing a hand over the boy's hair, and the crowd laughed warmly. The host, clearly emotional, turned toward the cameras. "This, right here, is why live television still matters. Not for the drama, but for the truth." As the segment ended and the lights dimmed, the applause lingered, wrapping around the room like a final act of gratitude. And somewhere deep in that moment, everyone knew they had just witnessed something real, a quiet kind of greatness that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off.